The hot midday in Babylon of 323 BC smells of dust, thick incense, and that peculiar, hidden fear that is born only in the premonition of an era's end. In the immense palace of Nebuchadnezzar, amidst painted walls adorned with glazed bricks and cool colonnades, on the royal bed lies a man who, in 12 years, transformed the boundaries of the known world into his personal domain. He is only 32 years old. He has not lost a single battle, has traveled thousands of miles across rocky deserts, scorching salt flats, and snow-covered passes, but now his main and only enemy is his own body. Dozens of warriors, stern veterans with hardened skin and scars obtained during the siege of impregnable Tyre and in the dust of Gaugamela, pass by him in deep, almost palpable silence. They look at their leader, and in their eyes, accustomed to the sight of blood and iron, a mute, frightening question is frozen. How can one who was considered the son of a god simply fade away like the most ordinary mortal? Alexander barely moves his eyes, recognizing his loyal comrades, but his voice has already abandoned him, turning into a broken whisper. History's greatest mystery begins its countdown right here, in the silence of these stuffy rooms, where the earthly path of a man ends and an endless, eternal legend begins. To fully comprehend how a youth from a small and harsh northern kingdom could make the greatest powers of the East tremble, one must look into the rocky mountains of Macedonia in the mid-4th century BC. This was a land of warriors, shepherds, and hunters, which the enlightened and at times arrogant Greeks considered almost a barbaric outpost of civilization. Alexander's father, Philip II, was a man of steel character and sharp intellect. He transformed fragmented, perpetually warring tribes into the most effective and disciplined military machine of antiquity. It was he who taught the infantry to wield sarissas, heavy 6-meter spears, creating the famous Macedonian phalanx, which became an impenetrable wall for any enemy. But if Philip painstakingly and for a long time forged this sword, then Alexander became the very tip that directed this sword into the heart of the world. His education was overseen by none other than Aristotle, the greatest mind of his time. He instilled in the youth a love for Homeric epics, biology, and political science. It was said that Alexander, until the end of his days, slept with a scroll of the Iliad under his pillow next to his battle dagger. In his dreams, he saw himself as a new Achilles, a hero whose destiny was predetermined in the heavens of Olympus. This unshakable belief in his own messianism, in his divine spark, became the colossal energy that later spilled over the boundless expanses of Asia. The first truly serious test of strength came when Alexander was only 20 years old. Philip's sudden and tragic death could have been a fatal end for the young state, surrounded on all sides by ill-wishers. Neighbors to the north, the Thracians and Illyrians, as well as the proud Greek polis to the south, instantly decided that the time had come to throw off the Macedonian yoke. They saw in Alexander only an inexperienced boy. However, the young king began to act with that supernatural speed of lightning, which would later be called his main strategic signature. He did not wait for numerous enemies to unite into a single alliance. Within weeks, he made a swift dash to the north, and then, just as suddenly, appeared at the walls of rebellious Thebes. The brutal suppression of the rebellion showed everyone the heir to the throne was not just an ambitious youth, but a calculating, cold, and decisive ruler. Having secured his rear and affirmed his power within the country, Alexander turned his gaze eastward. There, beyond the narrow Hellespont Strait, lay the vast Persian Empire, whose possessions stretched from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. This colossal power seemed eternal and absolutely unshakable to contemporaries. Its riches were countless, and armies, summoned from all over the world, numbered hundreds of thousands of people. But Alexander, possessing the insight of a strategist, saw not external power, but a colossus with feet of clay, a system shackled by its own weight, the corruption of satraps, and unwieldy bureaucracy. The army's crossing into Asia Minor in the spring of 334 BC was staged not as an ordinary raid, but as a sacred campaign for liberation. Stepping onto the Asian shore, Alexander was the first to plunge his spear into the ground, officially declaring these lands his by right of the spear, an ancient law of the conqueror. The first clash on the Granicus River clearly demonstrated the qualitative difference between Macedonian determination and Persian slowness. Alexander personally, not hiding behind bodyguards, led the attack of the heavy cavalry, narrowly escaping death in a fierce hand-to-hand combat. This style of command, always at the forefront, always in the very epicenter of the battle, created an unbreakable, almost mystical connection between him and his soldiers. The warriors saw his gilded armor sparkling in the sun's rays, saw his fresh wounds, and believed that as long as he personally led them, the very concept of defeat was simply impossible.
The subsequent victory at Issus,
In the valley between the mountains and the sea, definitively turned the tide of history. The Persian king Darius III, possessing a vast numerical superiority, could not withstand the Macedonian wedge's onslaught and fled the battlefield in the midst of the battle. He abandoned his family, his luxurious camp, and untold treasures. The world suddenly realized the old era of great Eastern kings was over. A time of unbridled ambitions, recognizing no geographical or moral boundaries, had arrived. However, the conquest of the East was for Alexander not only a matter of brute physical force, but also a question of iron will and technological superiority. The siege of Tyre, the richest fortress city located on an island 800 meters from the shore, lasted a long 7 months. The Persians and Phoenicians considered Tyre absolutely impregnable, securely protected by the sea and high stone walls. But Alexander, who tolerated no impossible, ordered his army to build a gigantic causeway across the sea strait. It was a genuine triumph of engineering thought and human perseverance over natural obstacles. When the walls fell and the city was taken, it became clear there was no obstacle that the Macedonian genius could not overcome. The further path led to Egypt. The ancient land of pyramids greeted him not as an invader, but as a long-awaited liberator from Persian oppression and a living god. In the deep Siwa oasis, lost amidst the scorching sands of the Sahara, the priests of the Temple of Amun officially confirmed what Alexander had believed in his heart since childhood. He was not merely a man, he was a direct chosen one of higher powers. This mystical revelation forever changed his inner world. He began to gradually distance himself from his Macedonian roots, started wearing elements of Eastern attire, adopting the etiquette and customs of the conquered peoples. This caused a muffled, growing discontent among his old comrades in arms, who wanted to see in him only their military leader, not an Eastern despot. But Alexander could no longer stop. He saw himself as the creator of a new humanity, in which Greek culture and Eastern wisdom would merge in a single impulse. The central conflict of this unprecedented campaign unfolded not only on dusty battlefields but also in the minds and hearts of men. Outwardly, it was a classic struggle for continental dominance, a global redrawing of the world's political map. The Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC became the decisive chord of this drama. Darius chose an ideal, flat field for the maneuvers of his numerous scythed chariots. His numerical superiority was truly overwhelming. It seemed the Macedonian army would simply drown in a sea of enemies. But Alexander, maintaining icy composure, applied the ingenious tactic of the oblique attack. He deliberately stretched his front, waited for the moment when a microscopic breach appeared in the Persian line, and directed a powerful striking wedge of companion cavalry straight into the Persian king's position. Darius's repeated flight meant the final collapse of the great Achaemenid Empire, which had existed for centuries. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, magnificent jewels of the East with their gardens and treasuries, fell at the young king's feet. But it was precisely here, at the peak of success, that a deep internal conflict began, one that proved far more complex and dangerous than any military maneuvers. Alexander faced an insoluble dilemma. Should he remain king of the Macedonians, bound by traditions and the Council of Elders, or become an absolute ruler of the world, uniting West and East into a single cosmopolitan empire? His persistent attempts to synthesize cultures led to tragic friction. He demanded that his Greek officers perform proskinesis, a deep prostration that, for freedom-loving Hellenes, was acceptable only when addressing gods. His closest friends, with whom he had shared meager food and cold nights on campaigns, began to see him as a tyrant, blinded by his own inhuman greatness. Conspiracies, whispers behind his back, and paranoid suspicions began to poison the atmosphere in the high command. One day, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, fueled by wine, during a boisterous feast, Alexander took the life of Clytus the Black, a man who had once saved him from certain death at the Battle of the Granicus. This was a profound personal tragedy. The king's remorse was as tempestuous and devastating as his anger, but the rift in his relationship with the army, whose loyalty was the guarantee of his power, remained forever. Alexander became increasingly isolated on the icy pinnacle of his might. The philosophical conflict of his life lay in an indomitable, almost morbid desire to reach the very edge of the inhabited earth. For him, conquests were never merely banal plunder or the mechanical expansion of state territories. It was a metaphysical search for the limits of human capabilities and knowledge. He passionately wanted to reach the great outer ocean, which, according to the geographical conceptions of the time, washed over the entire inhabited world. The campaign into mysterious India became the culmination of this aspiration. The battle on the Hydaspes River against the courageous King Porus, who for the first time massively used huge war elephants in battle, was the bloodiest and most exhausting ordeal for the Macedonians. The nature of India, with its endless, maddening monsoon rains, unfamiliar tropical diseases, and impenetrable dense jungles, gradually eroded the army's iron fighting spirit. When the exhausted troops reached the banks of the Hyphasis River, a turning point in history arrived. The soldiers, who had not seen their homeland for more than 8 years, flatly refused to go any further. This was Alexander's first and only defeat, a bitter defeat not from an enemy, but from his own army, from the weariness of human metal itself. He had to turn back, forever giving up the dream of seeing the ends of the earth. The arduous return through the lifeless Gedrosian desert became a true test of physical and spiritual endurance. The heat, sand, and chronic thirst claimed more lives of his loyal warriors than all previous battles combined. During this period, Alexander displayed true nobility. sharing all hardships equally with the most common soldiers. A widely known incident occurred during the height of the march when he was offered a helmet with the last drops of precious water found in the desert, and he, in front of everyone, poured them onto the sand, refusing to drink alone when his men were suffering. This theatrical but sincere gesture momentarily brought back the army's boundless love. But the physical and nervous exhaustion of the king himself was already taking its toll. Upon returning to Babylon, he did not rest. On the contrary, with renewed energy, he began planning grand new campaigns. To Arabia, along the coasts of Africa to Carthage, and further west, to the Pillars of Hercules. He wanted to transform Babylon into the shining capital of his new universal empire, where former enemies, Macedonians and Persians, would live in harmony, cemented by thousands of mixed marriages which he personally encouraged. But fate, which until then had been so kind to him, had other plans. In early June of 323 BC, after a long feast, Alexander felt a sudden malaise. A severe fever intensified with each passing day. Modern researchers and doctors still fiercely debate the real causes of his demise. Versions include malaria, typhoid fever, delayed consequences of numerous old wounds, or even a complex poison that might have been administered by someone from his inner circle, who seriously feared new decades of endless wars. In 2 weeks, the great commander, whose name made nations tremble, turned into a silent shadow of himself. His sudden departure caused an enormous shock, which echoed powerfully from the Balkan Mountains to the banks of the Indus. The vast world he had just united by his will was suddenly left without a head. They say that on his last breath, when asked to whom he left his immense kingdom, Alexander whispered only one word: to the strongest. The culmination of his life's journey came not at the moment of his triumphant entry into Babylon, but precisely at the moment of this frightening uncertainty. Immediately after his death, the empire he had created began to rapidly disintegrate. His generals, the so-called Diadochi, who had been loyal companions just yesterday, instantly turned into sworn enemies and began a bloody, multi-year struggle for his legacy. But what Alexander had managed to create in his short years could no longer be completely destroyed or erased from memory. He forever changed the cultural and genetic code of all human civilization. The Hellenistic era, which followed his campaigns, became a time of unprecedented cultural exchange and scientific progress in history. For many centuries, the Greek language became the language of international communication, high science, and refined philosophy across the gigantic expanses of Eurasia. Dozens of cities named after him, from Alexandria in Egypt to Alexandria Eschate in Central Asia, became global centers of enlightenment. The Great Library in Egyptian Alexandria became for many centuries the main repository of all accumulated human wisdom. The resonance of his unique personality is distinctly felt even in our time. Alexander the Great became the absolute standard for a world conqueror, revered and emulated for centuries by leaders such as Gaius Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte. But his example is not only a classic story of military success, it is a profound philosophical parable about the ultimate price of human ambition. He vividly demonstrated that a single individual is capable of changing the entire course of world history. Yet, he was also the first to show that even the greatest and most powerful empire cannot long endure solely on the steel will of one leader. Alexander's main lessons are that the true and lasting unity of peoples is achieved not only by the gleam of swords and the might of weapons, but also by the power of creative ideas and genuine respect for foreign cultures and traditions. His historical paradox lies in the fact that, fanatically striving for absolute sole dominion, he unwittingly created conditions for an unprecedented flourishing of cultural diversity. Today, looking at the picturesque ruins of cities he once founded in the heat of campaigns, we begin to understand his true and most valuable conquest was not lands or gold, but time itself and the space of memory. He remained in humanity's consciousness as an eternal symbol of unfading youth, reckless audacity, and an eternal striving for the unattainable horizon. His life is a vivid, searing reminder that any boundaries and limits exist primarily in our own minds. Returning to that initial scene in Babylon, where stern, weeping warriors bid farewell to their young king, we see not just a tragic end to an earthly journey, we witness the very moment of the birth of the greatest myth. Alexander left without leaving a direct heir to the throne, but he left behind a world that could never, under any circumstances, be the same again. He proved to all humanity that the true scale of a personality is determined not by the number of years lived, but by the exceptional depth and vividness of the mark left in history. And this fiery trail, like the path of his invincible army through endless sands and cloud-kissing mountains, remains distinctly visible even after more than 2 millennia. It continues to inspire everyone who finds the courage to dream of something more than just a calm and measured existence. Concluding this grand historical narrative, we once again, in the cycle of time, find ourselves at the bedside of the fading king in Babylon. In the heavy silence of the palace, only distant, muffled sounds of the enormous city which he so sincerely wished to make the new center of the universe are audible. His gaze, once piercing, clear, and terrifying to enemies, is now directed far beyond the visible world, into the cold infinity of eternity. He did what seemed absolutely impossible to all his contemporaries. He physically reached the very edge. But this edge turned out to be only the beginning of something completely new and unknown. The legend of the son of a god, of an invincible hero whose name became synonymous with greatness, was only just beginning its triumphant march across the pages of chronicles and folktales at that moment. And in this endless, rhythmic movement through the hoary ages, Alexander the Great continues his eternal campaign, tirelessly reminding us that true greatness is not only resounding victories and conquered peoples, but also that inextinguishable inner spark that compels humanity to believe in the impossible and to strive for distant stars, despite any obstacles.